This might look like something from an upscale bakery, but it was made with just 3 ingredients: flour, water, and salt in a regular home kitchen. What makes it rise and develop its crust and flavor isn't store bought yeast, it's a natural fermentation process that's been used by humans for thousands of years. This is sourdough bread. Hi everyone, I'm Lily, and today I'm going to inform you how to bake sourdough bread completely from scratch. It's one of the oldest forms of baking and has made a comeback in recent years, especially during the pandemic. While it might seem complicated at first glance, once you understand the steps, it becomes a pretty easy process, even for beginner bakers. This speech is going to walk you through 3 key parts of the sourdough process. 1. How to make and maintain your sourdough starter. 2. How to mix, shape, and ferment your dough. And 3. How to bake and store the final loaf. Let's start with the most important part of the entire process, the starter. A sourdough starter is a living mixture of flour and water that captures wild yeast and good bacteria from the environment. This natural fermentation is what gives sourdough its rise and unique flavor. According to The Perfect Loaf, a sourdough starter is created by mixing equal parts flour and water and leaving it at room temperature. Each day, you discard half and feed it with more fresh flour and water. And then after about 5 to 7 days of this routine, the mixture begins to bubble and double in size, which means it's alive and it's active. It's what we call an active starter. Food YouTuber Joshua Wiseman describes the process in his video, Sourdough Bread for Beginners, comparing a starter to a pet. He says you have to feed it regularly, pay attention to it, and keep it warm. If you skip a day or two, it starts to weaken, and if you feed it consistently, it gets stronger and more predictable. The King Arthur Baking Company, which is the bread flour that I use to make my sourdough, also points out that temperature is key, which is true. A warm environment would be ideally around 75 degrees Fahrenheit is best for fermentation. If your kitchen is too cold, placing the jar in an oven with the light turned on but no heat is a pretty good solution to that. Once your starter is bubbly and it has a mild sour aroma, it can double in volume within 4 to 6 hours of feeding. It's ready to be used in your first loaf. Once the starter is active, the next step is mixing and shaping the dough. Sourdough bread is unique because it doesn't rely on regular dough kneading. Instead, it uses a gentler method called stretch and fold during a process called bulk fermentation. To begin, you mix your active starter with flour, water, and salt. The Clever Carrot blog recommends starting with the technique called autolys, which is where you let the flour and water rest for 30 minutes before adding the salt and starter. This improves hydration and helps the gluten start to develop naturally. Once all the ingredients are combined, the dough is covered and left at room temperature. Every 30 minutes to an hour, you perform a set of stretch and folds where you gently pull and fold the dough over itself, kind of like this, and then you usually do it to 3 to 4 times total. Foolproof Baking explains that these folds help build gluten structure without the need for heavy kneading. This process takes between 4 and 6 hours depending on how warm the room is. After the bulk fermentation, the dough is turned out onto a floured surface, and you shape it into a round oval called a boule or batard, and you put it in a proofing basket. Then it's covered and refrigerated overnight in a step called cold proofing. Cold proofing serves 2 important purposes. It makes the dough easier to handle, and it gives the final bread more flavor. The long, slow fermentation allows acid and gases to develop, which help create that, classic sourdough tang that we know and love. Once the dough has been cold proofed, it's ready for the final step, which is baking and storing it, which is really important because you don't want it to go bad after all that work. To bake the sourdough correctly, you need a hot environment that traps steam. This is why most bakers use a Dutch oven, which is a heavy leaded pot that retains heat and moisture. Food 52 recommends preheating the Dutch oven in your main oven to 450 degrees for at least 30 to 45 minutes, which ensures the pot is hot enough to create the right crust, and oven spring, which is when the dough rapidly expands in the first 10 minutes of baking. Once preheated, you carefully place your dough inside, usually on a piece of parchment paper, and you score it with a razor blade or sharp knife to control how it expands. Let some air out. Then you bake it with the lid on for about 20 minutes, and then remove the lid for the final 20 to 25 minutes to allow for the bread to brown. And after baking, the patience is key. The kitchen says the bread needs to cool for at least an hour before slicing, which is true. Cutting into it too soon can cause a gummy, undercooked interior, and this is because the starches are still setting out, even if it comes out of the oven. To store the bread, you wrap it in a clean tea towel or place it in a paper bag. Avoid any plastic bags unless you're freezing it because they trap moisture and make the crust soft, and it can cause mold to grow. If the bread starts to go stale, don't throw it away. Sourdough makes excellent toast, croutons, or French toast. Now that we've gone through the full process, let's review the steps over again. In this speech, I've informed you how to make sourdough bread using natural fermentation, and I broke it into 3 clear steps, which is to first create a starter by mixing and feeding flour and water until it becomes active with wild yeast. Second, you mix and fold the dough gently during the bulk fermentation, and then shape and cold proof it overnight in the fridge. That is the hardest part for me by far. Cold proof is hard. And third, you bake it in a hot Dutch oven for steam and crust. Let it cool and store it to preserve its freshness. Sourdough might seem intimidating, but the process is really rewarding and, for me, therapeutic. It's not just like a trend, it's a hands on way to learn about fermentation, timing, and the chemistry of baking. And, by understanding how each step works from starter to storing it, anyone can bake sourdough at home using just a few simple ingredients and a little bit of patience, because I had to do it quite a few times before I got it. Thank you so much for listening. My sources I used were The Perfect Loaf for the method for creating and feeding the starter, Joshua Wiseman on YouTube for caring for the starter like a pet, King Arthur Baking for temperature recommendations for fermentation, and the Clever Carrot blog for dough mixing and stretch and fold method. And I used Foolproof Baking on YouTube for the bulk fermentation explanation. And then I also used Food 52 for the baking method and temperature. And I used The Kitchen for cooling and storing your finished loaf. Thank you.